I don't think Netanyahu has any sensible reason for continuing to have a war in Gaza. He's won the war. The war has been won in all practical terms. The one unrealized objective is, of course, the release of the hostages.
Now, let us get the thoughts of the wisdom of Sir Malcolm Rifkind, a former Foreign Secretary. Welcome to the program, Malcolm.
Thank you very much.
So, look, this story is moving, as you can hear, very rapidly. We now have the official confirmation that Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, has been killed by an Israeli military strike. And we will reflect on that and on where this development takes the entire story, the narrative in the Middle East. So let me, first of all, ask for your reaction to the news of the death of Yahya Sinwar, which is in itself a big moment.
I think it's difficult to exaggerate its importance. I think there are two profound consequences that flow from this. One is within Gaza itself. Hamas effectively is now disintegrating. There is no comparable person who could take over the leadership. And if Hamas survives in any form, it'll be as a disparate number of very small Hamas activists or militants in various parts of Gaza, but without any central leadership that really matters. There's also small other terrorist organizations like Islamic Jihad. So there are still terrorists who are going to be active there, but of a profoundly different level of competence than the kind of leadership that Sinwar was able to give. That's the first consequence. The second is much more international. And that is what has now happened is the effective collapse of Iran's what they called their axis of resistance. For the years, Iran has not sought to send its own troops to fight against Israelis, except through missiles occasionally. But what it's relied on has been three allies. One is Hamas, second was Hezbollah, and the third were the Houthis in Yemen. Now, Hamas effectively is now destroyed as a militant military force. It will have individuals left, but without any significant ability to harm Israel as a whole. Hezbollah is profoundly weakened, both by the death of Nasrallah and by what is happening at the moment to its military capability. And the Houthis were never more than very serious nuisance value. They sent missiles from Yemen, but they were not a direct threat to Israel's security. So this leaves Iran with a huge problem, given that it is the prime enemy of Israel. It's been responsible for everything we've seen, ultimately, by creating or funding these terrorist organizations. And now they've been destroyed or are being destroyed. Iran has to decide, can it continue effectively? It will continue the rhetoric, but can it actually continue the policy of practical support for people who are no longer there to be supported?
Okay, so a number of significant and very, very interesting thoughts and observations from you there, Malcolm Rifkind. Let me just take one or two of those in turn. You make the point, you observe that Hamas now, with the confirmed death of Yahya Sinwar, is now effectively broken, shattered from the head down. They've lost their chief leader, which leaves them effectively in bits. How do you judge Israel should and will react to this in Gaza?
Right. Well, the first point I make is, of course, it's not just Sinwar's death by itself. Sinwar was the last of the leading members of Hamas to have survived. The others had already been dispatched and were no longer around. So it is the completion of a course. Now, you say, what is its impact in Gaza? I don't think Netanyahu has any sensible reason for continuing to have a war in Gaza. He's won the war. The war has been won in all practical terms. The one unrealized objective is, of course, the release of the hostages. And he's now in a very important position to decide how he's going to achieve that, because he will never be forgiven by the Israelis if, despite all his strength, he does not get the remaining over 100 hostages released and able to return to Israel. Now, to do that, he has to make some sort of concessions, not that affect Israel's security, but that allow the remaining Hamas individuals, as your previous speaker was saying, from the retired general from Israeli intelligence was saying, I think he was absolutely right. There should be some sort of deal, which could involve allowing some of the minor members of Hamas to leave Gaza safely. So the Israeli objective should be twofold: primarily to get the hostages released, and secondly, just to get every Hamas member who continues to identify with Hamas out of Gaza.
We're following the developing breaking news after the death of Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas. We've heard in the last few moments from the Israeli leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, speaking there from Israel. Now let's get the thoughts of Zach Anders, our correspondent, who is in Tel Aviv, moved, I think, to the north of the city. Zach, welcome back.
Hey, John, I'm actually on the Gaza border now in the city of Sderot in the south.
All right, so you're on the Gaza border, and I think you're seeing some of the response of people there to the news of Sinwar's death.
Well, we see inside the city here in Sderot, which back on October 7th was one of the hardest hit major cities in Israel's south. Hamas terrorist gunmen were in the city for hours and killing people on the streets. When you talk to people that live here, they remember that day very vividly as being locked in to their homes. Today, they've all come out. They're waving the Israeli flag. Cars we've been hearing honking on the highway consistently. And this moment here for them feels like it's the start of the end of the war on the Israeli side. But behind me, as I look into the Gaza Strip in the last 30 minutes, I've still seen explosions in the northern half of the Gaza Strip as well.
Right. So that conflict's still going on, even while Israelis celebrate the death of Sinwar and hope for something better flowing from all of this. Zach, you were listening then to Benjamin Netanyahu. What did you make of his statement?
I think that we just heard him propose essentially an end to this conflict if Hamas was to accept it. The way I interpreted was lay down your arms, release the hostages, and you will be granted immunity, which I think is a remarkable element here and potentially a real off-ramp for this conflict if there are, and certainly there are, hundreds of Hamas men, faithful fighters who are still alive, who are still combating Israeli ground forces as we speak. If they choose to surrender, from what I make of that statement, that they will not be held and taken into Israeli prisons, that they will be allowed to stay in the Gaza Strip. I'm not entirely sure if that's the intent behind what we just heard, but from the Israeli side, that's the interpretation I'm getting from Israeli folks here, is that that is the proposal on the table now, but it is certainly dependent on collecting and releasing hostages who no doubt are fragmented all across the Gaza Strip, held by different factions, different groups of Hamas men throughout the Strip are still holding on to those hostages.
Right, interesting that's the interpretation of what we heard from Netanyahu. You're picking up from the Israelis that you're talking to there, Zach. And what we got from Netanyahu himself was in blunter, plainer terms. He said, "Give up the hostages, surrender, you will be saved." He didn't spell out what saved meant, so I guess we have to wait for some sort of clarification of that. But I guess we will see. Does it bear precisely the interpretation you were setting out there? How would that go down with the Israeli public, and in as far as Zach as one can generalize on that? If they were to be offered that kind of amnesty, how would that go down with Israelis?
And that's a good question. And I think that the main concern for the Israeli side is whether or not they can tolerate politically any sort of option. Well, I should just say that I think the majority of Israelis would accept any outcome that gets the hostages out, that there will be a complete acceptance of that scenario. But if this was to be an end to the conflict, well, I think now tonight Israelis feel as though they have defeated Hamas in the sense that the men behind, it's not just Yahya Sinwar who was killed today. Over the last few months, it's Mohammed Def, a commander who's been in Israel's crosshairs for decades. Of course, Ismail Haniyeh killed in that bombing in Tehran. So I think for Israelis, if there's a deal on the table that gets the hostages out, but doesn't mean that all of the remaining Hamas men are going to be brought into already overflowing Israeli prisons, I think that's accepted outright.
All right. Zach, always good to get your talk and your reporting there, live from near to the Gaza border. Zach Anders there.